G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and so far you are having a fantastic week. Now I just want to take a moment at the very beginning of the video to say thank you for all of the lovely messages of support since I got my MRI results yesterday. Now of course in these results we would love to see the tumour shrink a little bit, but it does seem what we're doing, the chemo, maybe my keto diet is holding this at bay. And really the goal is at this point in time to hold this at bay while I have no neurological deficits. It's not worth going in for surgery because I will have deficit come from that surgery, and it's not worth doing as the tumour doesn't have any at the moment, giving the risk versus reward and the incurable nature of this as it would come back. What we're trying to do is hold the tumour at bay for as long as possible, hoping that future development of treatment will have better outcomes for myself. Now, legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. I want to show you a drone that I've been talking about for a while, but maybe we have an image of it today. We'll go over Operation Spiderweb. Of course, this was the operation of Ukrainian intelligence services infiltrating into Russia, drones on trucks and striking a number of Russian strategic assets. Now, as we always say, give it a couple of days and you'll get footage, you'll get imagery of what has actually occurred. And today we have a pretty close to what I believe will be the final number of what was damaged, what was destroyed, as we have the full footage available. Now, many people are then fearing what the retaliatory strikes are going to look like. We've seen Trump talk about it, we've seen Putin talk about it, and we've seen Medvedev talk about it, and the whole internet is. And I'm going to go over what I think we may see or what may be the best to exploit current advantages, given the nature of where strategy and tactics are at different sides in this war currently, and optics and support as well. So there's a lot in that. I didn't explain that well, but it'll make sense when we go through it. Of course, we will have a look at the maps, see where things are moving around, and see what some analysts are saying about certain areas too. And then finally, we're going to talk about the German Chief of Defense speaking about Russian buildup, and what he has said has really gone against a lot of the information put out by NATO analysts, military leaders, politicians about everything that the Russians are making is being used and destroyed, where he's saying, well, no, there is building up for further operations in the future. Sorry, I'm going to have to cut this in, legends. I completely forgot. I wanted this in the beginning. What you and I have been speaking of, we've been speaking of a longer range Russian drone being able to carry FPV drones further into the fight, then act as a repeater for those FPVs to have strikes 20 kilometers plus behind the front line. And what we see here is a Russian Molniya kamikaze UAV carrying an FPV. And this sort of makeup is exactly what we were told about behind the scenes and exactly what we have been speaking about. The larger drone goes up and above the electronic warfare. It goes beyond that electronic warfare, then acts as a repeater as it is a larger station for a smaller FPV drone. And this is very interesting for myself to see. So let's start with Operation Spiderweb and what has occurred here. Now, what we do know is a number of strategic assets were taken out. Now, the SBU today has released the full 4-minute and 40-second video here. Now, I'm not going to go through this one by one with you. If you would like to do that yourself, well, I'm sure you could find it anywhere on the internet, but on my Telegram chat, there is also this full video here. And we see some of the footage we've seen before of Tu-95s being hit. We see, of course, Tu-22s being hit. We see that the tyres didn't really do their job, but there's some specifics in this video that I do want to talk about. And if we then overlay this with satellite imagery, what was the overall battle damage assessment from this? Again, if more comes out, we will update as we go. Now, the SBU's post as a result, 41 Russian strategic aviation military aircraft were hit. So this is absolute total of hits, not destroyed like many are reporting, and many have reported. Many reported day one that 41 were destroyed or damaged, and you just need to wait out on this and wait for the actual confirmation, because we say this will come because, of course, Ukraine want to exploit the informational victory of this strategic strike, okay? So we have then from Geo confirmed here in his full analysis of the video, what he is saying is total that there was 12 destroyed, attacked was 11 further from the actual footage here, And if we then break this down then further, he is saying that no, overall, we see that 7 Tu-95s were destroyed, 4 Tu-22s were destroyed, and 1 AN-12, this is more a cargo one, was destroyed along with then these attacks here. Now, many others are saying that it's actually 8 Tu-95s. It does bump that number up, such as AMK, and I believe from what I've seen, it's likely 8 Tu-95s. Remember, this is from satellite imagery. This is from then the video that we are seeing here, and the way to then confirm this. And let's go over then AMK mappings imagery here. On this airbase, we see 4 Tu-95s and that AN-12, and the final total of aircraft overall is 8 Tu-95s, 4 Tu-22s, and 1 AN-12. So, of course, this brings us to 13 aircraft overall. And you can see the footage here, and you can see the level of destruction of these ones. I'm sure guys with a couple of spanners will be able to rebuild that. You can see that some of these are completely destroyed. You'll also see where some of these aircraft have been struck, these Tu-95s, and then you'll see like this Tu-160 sitting here. Now, of course, this isn't taken as of the time, so this 160 likely was not sitting there as this image was taken, but I'll talk more about the Tu-160 in a little bit. So this is at Olynya Air Base, and he's given the total overall. This is at Irkutsk Air Base. We can see where the 4 Tu-95s have been hit since the attack. One of the wings has fallen off, and 4 Tu-22 M3 bombers were hit also. So this is going into our total number that we've got from AMK and as well from GeoConfirmed. And then further, this is at the Olynya Air Base that we have 3 Tu-95s were hit, and the reports of destruction of 160s have been confirmed to be false. And we've seen a lot of movement of Tu-160s recently to other air bases. And remember, a lot of these got up in the air as this attack was going on, as it is the safest place for them. So let's go over some more specifics in the video. What we see on a number of the Tu-95 aircraft was that they were carrying missiles on board. I believe this is a KH-101 missile here. We see that those were likely ready to go for an attack. Now, what I've been saying from the initial day we saw was there's claims around A-50, and A-50, in my opinion, is more important than the rest of these aircraft for the command and control of other air assets. So in this footage, we see at 1:34 and at 2 minutes, we see these A-50s then being attacked. Remember, many are saying that these were destroyed. So I'll show you the footage, but we see in a screenshot from here in this footage that there's no engines on these. And these aircraft, to me, given what the fuselage looks like, where they're sitting, the completely terrible condition of these aircraft, they appear to be non-operational, mothballed, used for spare parts. And what we do know is any Cold War Soviet-era aircraft like this in Russia or across even ex-Soviet then states, there's aircraft like this sitting a bit of everywhere. So we can see this one being struck here. We can see the terrible condition of this aircraft. I think that it is likely not in service currently, and we can also see that this isn't clear what damage this has occurred to the aircraft either. We can see the hovering of the drone here. Many said that there was a lot of electronic warfare impacting these drones at the time, especially on this base. And then we have another at then 2 minutes on the footage. If we scroll forward, we then see the one on the other side, again, in terrible shape, and is absolutely not confirmation of the destruction. Either wait for some more satellite imagery, but I think at this point in time, and I'll correct myself if I'm wrong, but those were likely decommissioned aircraft. But again, A-50s, incredibly, incredibly important. So let's go over what our conclusion is of these strikes overall. Now, I still share what I initially said about this attack. Given the inability to counter an attack like this, and the defenses actually set up anywhere in the globe for an attack like this, I think the intelligence services, so Ukraine's intelligence services, and I'm sure all the ones on the back end of this enabling this also, I think they got unlucky that there wasn't 100 destroyed aircraft. I think that Ukraine got unlucky with 13, and I think Russia got incredibly lucky that it was only 13 also. I think given the capacity of this, given the inability to counter it, given that it went off, I think if you shared this with me prior, if you sent me this is what's happening and the Russians aren't onto it and they're going to fly out and strike this, I would have said, shit, you're looking at massive amounts. 13's a lot. I'm not trying to deny that. What I'm saying is I think the Russians are lucky it wasn't 80 or 100 of that. Now, this is a case study of an offensive attack. And what I've said previously too is this isn't exclusive. And we need to learn from offensive operations on how to then defend. As I've shown you on Google Maps, many of our most important aircraft, they sit 2 kilometres from main roads. Trucks with radio-controlled drones or fibre-optic controlled drones and a base station could easily disable entire squadrons at once. And I've been thinking more about this and talking to some of my friends behind the scenes too. If you had years of planning to go over this, a motivated adversary could disable basically an entire air force in minutes. We need to look from intelligence services to placement of bases and placement of aircraft and everything of how do we stop this happening on our own bases. Now, many have asked, why no Tu-160? And there's 2 trains of thought here, and these are not mutually exclusive. It can be a bit of both. The Tu-160 is Russia's most capable strategic bomber. Supersonic, incredibly quick, carry nuclear weapons, but because of that, we've seen this barely used in the conflict at all. It's very rare Tu-160s get used, probably going to become more common that they are used after the destruction of some of these other assets. But the Tu-160 is really a nuclear doomsday system. It's less stealthy than a B-1 bomber, a bone, but it is faster and it has more payload as well. So it would be great optics to take out something like this, but it would likely have less effect on the missions we see going forward compared to Tu-95s or Tu-22s. But this is where the second train of thought comes in, is these bombers are also part of Russia's nuclear triad, albeit the air bomber aspect of this is the weakest part compared to subs and ground launch systems as well. But of the arm of the Air Force nuclear triad part, the Tu-160 is the strongest asset within that. And we do know America's concerns regarding striking nuclear triad forces, and maybe there was some level of avoiding specifically the Tu-160s. I don't know. Remember when Ukraine had strikes against the over-the-horizon and early warning nuclear radars? And that was under the Biden administration, who was far more positive towards Ukraine than Trump is, and that got shut down very, very quickly. And we know this through comments like Mr. Keith Kellogg, the special envoy to Ukraine, has said people have to understand in the national security space, when you attack an opponent's part of their national survival system, which is their triad, the nuclear triad, that means your risk level goes up because you don't know what the other side is going to do. You're not sure. So it could be part of this as well. Maybe as well, it just wasn't as available to strike those aircraft. Now, Trump has been silent for 3 days, which says a lot about this strike, and now has come out with this truth social page with this like tweet truth thing. And it is interesting that it had been quiet on this for 3 days, and it's not written as aggressively. It's written a lot more benign than typically he writes in this. I just finished speaking by telephone to President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The call lasted approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. We discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes by Ukraine, and also various other attacks that have been taking place by both sides. It was a good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace. President Putin did say, and very strongly, that he will have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. So put a pin in that. We'll speak about what we may see as retaliation strikes. We also discussed Iran and the fact that time is running out on Iran's decision pertaining to nuclear weapons, which must be made quickly. I stated to President Putin that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and on this, I believe that we are in agreement. President Putin suggested that he will participate in the discussions with Iran and that he could perhaps be helpful in getting this brought to a rapid conclusion. So Netanyahu won't be happy about this. It is in my opinion that Iran has been slow walking their decision on this very important matter, and we will need a definitive answer in a very short period of time. And I've been saying for some years now, a lot of Russia's biggest leverage and their ability to threaten, or just the ability to escalate, or the ability to threat to escalate in this war, is outside of Europe. It's not in Ukraine, it's not in Russia, it's in other countries of which they are allied with, that of course the West doesn't want gaining many of the systems that Russia has. And the US, NATO, other states, they know that Russia has technology that Iran, North Korea will literally die for. And they have technology and systems that could be given to those states to absolutely reshape the balance of power in those sectors of the globe also. And I've spoken about this over a number of years, that one of the ways to escalate this isn't of dropping this bomb in Ukraine. It is, right, we're going to make ties with, say, Iran, and maybe a technology give and take of drones for whatever goes, and that can absolutely shift where the US and one of their nations they support no matter what, of Israel, can be in the Middle East. So that has a lot there. So it'll be interesting to see if Putin will play ball with Trump here to gain more trust and further leverage in the conflict in Ukraine. So let's go over this, because of course there's a lot of talk about retaliation, payback strikes after this. We've seen Medvedev make comments, we've seen Trump talk about it, we've seen Putin talk about it. And what do I think? I think there will be some show of force strike, maybe Otterschneck, maybe a large attack of missiles and drones, but it will not be, as some are saying, some decisive blow. What we know in a conventional attritional war like this, that decisive blows don't exist, at least in conventional aspect. That Russia's aim with the nightly routine of drones and missiles is to keep the pressure on, keep that pressure up, limit reconstitution of forces, and strike logistics and wear down Ukraine's air defense. And the best way to do this is the same as on the front line. You don't seek once in a blue moon massive attack. It's just constant pressure grinding forward, never the time to completely reconstitute all of that. And successive attacks, they are a single instrument in the orchestra of attritional war. And the other instruments are tactical actions, and this is played to make a symphony. And this is the thing, is you can't just be all tactic, you can't be all strategy. They need to mutually benefit each other. It can't be just weighted one way or the other. But the best way, like attrition, because they're trying to attrit then Ukraine strategically and tactically, is that constant pressure rather than using everything at once and then having a week of nothing. And I talk about that. It can't be peaks and troughs. You're better off with just a constant amount of force. So further, what do I think would be the most useful response to Operation Spiderweb? Because there needs to be some level of response here for the Russians to save face. Russia ultimately needs to continue two tasks. They need to limit Ukraine's industrial capacity, and that industrial capacity is Western support. They need to exploit their battlefield advantages and gains. So the advantages of the amount of resources on the front, from men to machine, and the gains of making more territory. Ultimately, this is a ground war. And in negotiations, territory will be and will take the leading role. Strategic strikes, they merely are there to support ground operations. Strategic strikes are not going to be the thing on the table in negotiation. No, the leading thing will be the ground war. Ultimately, this war will still be decided on the battlefield. Everything else just support that movement. Now, considerations. Propaganda, optics, informational warfare. This is important for Russia, but it's not as important for Russia as it is Ukraine. Russia is most of their support, their industrial sector is domestic. They're not relying on foreign support as Ukraine is. So propaganda, optics, informational warfare is exceptionally important for Ukraine. Large scale and larger scale missions, missiles, drones, attacks into cities, these have previously increased Western support to Ukraine. What we know is any attack like this is going to be incredibly expensive. It'll put further assets at risk, and it will ultimately lead to civilian casualties. What, of course, you then threaten an increase on then support as well. So it's all about this on the fulcrum point, balancing how do we limit further support, but then how do we exploit where we have advantage. So the outcome here would be, I think, a huge foot up the arse of the FSB, the intelligence services that missed this. Maybe, as we've seen previously, make up some bullshit arrests or whatever for those being held responsible to outwardly show, yes, we are taking care of this and this won't happen again. I think ultimately there will be some level of bravado show. Maybe there will be an Otoshnik used, but it would want to be used somewhere where you have a location to get the best possible filming of this too, because of course that does have huge informational victories too. You want, of course, like the US said, you want people to see it, potentially even a nuclear weapon used on a testing ground somewhere. But I think ultimately the best way to continue and buffer strategic loss is to lean into the advantage on tactical victory too. And the resources that may be tied up in trying to have strikes and retaliation, payback, whatever you want to call it here, those resources into increase frontline victories, more resources into FABs, into Garans, and push further on that front. Not to get caught in this tit-for-tat optic strategic strikes back and forward to go, well, ultimately this is still a ground war. We can't ignore that. We need our intelligence services to get off their ass and stop that occurring, but we still need to just leverage into tactical victory, because ultimately those tactical victories lead into strategic victories, and that is where Russia has the upper hand, as we see via the maps. So I think the best way for Russia to deal with this, while limiting while not having a huge increase in strikes on cities where you're going to have huge civilian casualties and lead into Western support, is to put a lot towards then front lines and move then the front more, because that has very similar for their own domestic support, seeing the line move. Yes, it's ignored completely in the Western media or bloggers, but that's not who they're trying to attract and say that there's been some level of retaliation here. It's their own supporters on that move of the line. I think it may be likely that we don't see a huge retaliation. Maybe, I'm probably going to be completely wrong on that point, but maybe more effort put to then increase destruction on the front line. So let's have a look at the maps. Here's Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now this map, this hasn't updated. Typically on Thursdays, it doesn't. If it does, I'll update you tomorrow. So where I want to come first is Sumy, of course, where Ukraine pushed across into Kursk at one point, capturing Sudzha, and now Russia has pushed back into Sumy, capturing a minimum, and this is an absolute minimum, of 154.5 kilometres squares. I'd say it is likely significantly more than this. So let's talk about this area and then have a look at a couple of maps. So what Suryak is saying is that on this front, the Russian army took full control of Yambalivkia and Andreevkia. So this is Yambalivkia in this sector here, and then further movements on the southern front of Andreevkia here, as well as a series of positions south of the last locality of Kindrakivka, which is this locality right here. So more movement coming from north to south from then Kursk Oblast. So as we say, this is putting a lot of pressure on areas like Sumy, and then further increases pressure on other areas of the front line, because Ukraine need to bring assets up into here to defend against this. Do I think that Russia has goals of Sumy? No, I don't. But I think they're trying to do what Ukraine tried to do in Kursk, of thinning out the front line. The thing is, the ability to move forces to thin out your enemy is really given to that force that has then larger numerical numbers. That's why Kursk, I said, yeah, it may thin out the Russian forces in Donbass, but it's also going to massively thin out the Ukrainian forces here too. And Speaking of these areas such as Kindrakivka, this is what Deep State Map talk about today. Kindrakivka, Russian infantry was recorded. It's going to be clarified. So wait out on that. Remember, Surak says right up to that point. Yambalivka sector is also under pressure, where we showed you in Yambalivka out here. So maybe wait out. We may see this move forward. But it's this that I'm interested in, and I spoke on yesterday. The situation remains critical due to the enemy's rapid advance to a distance of 20 to 25 kilometres, from which they are able to operate over Sumy with FPV drones on fibre optics, and they have already made similar attempts. The Defence Force are trying to contain their pressure on Moscow Horde and not to let them further into the territory. And this is what we have been talking about. We spoke about yesterday, is now that from the central Sumy to the furthest point here is 20 kilometres, we see a lot of drones like the one I've showed you in the beginning of this video are able to strike in here, as well as FAB glide munitions. And this is always a problem when you see the front line moving forwards. This is exactly what I've been talking about. We'll come back up to here in a second about this Terney front and the movement to Karpivka. Does this just create a huge kill zone in here now, as there has been a fatal funnel developed in here now that this is not much more than 10 kilometres. Now 20 kilometres, yes, we see FPVs working there, but we don't see the saturation at that we do see, of course, within that 10 kilometres. Tiet Kino around here, we have seen from Suryek there has been some Ukrainian movement into Kursk around here. Wait out on further confirmations on those maps. Let's look at what Tatragami UA says about this. This may be difficult to accept, but when I first raised concerns about Ukraine's offensive operations in the Kursk region, I correctly anticipated that it could ultimately lead to Russian forces retaking Kursk and then advancing gradually into Sumy Oblast and even eventually towards Dnipro. In hindsight, the offensive was proven far more costly than a limited incursion or strategic defence would have been. Remember what I said about Kursk when it first happened? What I was saying was, I think this will be a limited in, capture what we need, bag out, not what it became over 6 months. Short-term operation, lasting 2 to 4 weeks, aimed at creating a modest buffer zone inside Kursk, might have preserved resources. Instead, the campaign has resulted in significantly higher losses in both personnel and equipment. And at absolute best rate of attrition, Kursk was 1-to-1. It was likely worse than that, but what we do know is 1-to-1 attrition when you're fighting an enemy with 3 to 4 times your population, that is not in your favour. As of May 25, Ukraine has lost 994 confirmed vehicles in Kursk, compared with 791 on the Russian side. To put that in perspective, on the Avdiivka-Pokrovsk front, Ukrainian losses stood at 679 vehicles versus 2,352 for Russia. With Western military aid dwindling, US support reduced for political reasons, and Europe unable to supply adequate material, and Ukrainian forces struggling to replenish personnel, the scale of losses sustained in Kursk is nothing but a serious operational strategic misjudgment at the senior level. I will say from the day one of Kursk, it never made sense to me. And I believe our concerns and Tataragami's concerns around this, which him and I spoke about the concerns together as well, as in a further video you'll be able to see, were correct. As I have pointed out from the outset, Russia was ultimately able to concentrate sufficient forces to retake Kursk without significantly weakening its positions in Pokrovsk. Only very limited Russian units were redeployed from the Pokrovsk direction, while Ukraine shifted tens of thousands of troops, leaving that front undermanned and accelerating Russia's gains there. Unless the loss ratio begins to shift decisively in Ukraine's favour, Russian forces are likely to continue advancing, both into Sumy Oblast and gradually toward Dnipro. Yet, the Ukrainian military and political leadership at times appeared more focused on performative media operations than on articulating a long-term strategic vision for the battlefield beyond a few months. That is, that last line, performative media operation, than on articulating long-term strategic vision, I could not agree more with what we are seeing everywhere on the front. It's not that these other attacks on like Kerch Bridge, that it doesn't have some effect, but it's taken several months, a lot of risk, a lot of resources, whatever, for limited effect when we see the front line moving like it is. So let's have a look up and down the maps in other areas. Let's talk about Terney front line. We have a couple of updates in here. Now, Torshki down here, this is still all shown in green zone. We see Suryak today. He shows that Ukrainian forces were able to push the Russians back out of just where this green sector is down in here. Again, weighed out on that, as these maps never really showed similar. But as I've been saying, the area of the front I have the most concern on, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about this Karpivka to Lozove Oskil front. And what I said is, I don't know if the Russians will push much more west, but I think they'll focus on expanding this front here. And this is what we then see occurring. So this is Ridkadab, Karpivka movement into this area, expanding then down around Zeleny, Dolnya as well by this blue dot at the moment. I think, and this is exactly what I said the other day, I do believe what we will see, and I'm happy to be wrong on things. I think we'll see the Russians try and expand this front here and create a fatal funnel on this 10-kilometer gap in here, as it is the only way in and out of this complete sort of Borova sector. We may see Ukraine withdraw out of here. We may see them reinforcement. We may see a lot of counterattacks to try and stop this vertical strategic cutoff as well. So wait out on that. Now, let's talk about the Chasiv sector, and then we'll move our way down into Pokrovsk. No changes shown, of course. This map today, Chasiv Suryak maps, does show just down around Stopochke, there was some counterattacks by the Ukrainian forces. Remember, we had geolocated footage down in Stopochke of a Russian force the other day, and just in the center of Chasiv around where my cursor is at the moment, more pushing here. It does seem like most of Chasiv has come under Russian control. Then let's move into Pokrovsk East. And this is the eastern sector of Pokrovsk, or areas you'll be familiar with, like Yambalivka, Zoria. We saw attacks, of course, to then this tree line yesterday. It does seem like those attacks were able to take up some positions. Now, let's talk about this. So, further positions made just to then the north of Zoroya, taking over then their warehouses, and closing up between Zoroya and Romanivka, and further in the direction of Yambalivka. We saw that, of course, attack yesterday, and then further just expanding out. And we said this, there'll be a move up and expand, up and expand. It makes sense for saturation of other assets, and further movement out along this road then towards Konstantinivka and to the north of Malinivka, sort of squaring up this front line. Not surprised to see that. Then we come down Pokrovsk front line here, and of course movement towards then Dnipro Oblast. So, first map update we've got, this is sitting up and around then Uspanivka in the direction of Uzdashne, or just to the south of here, closing up territory here, and then closing up further territory just to the north of Oleksivkia as well, just where my cursor is here, sort of trying to flatten out that entire front line, and just to the south of where these two oblasts meet. We actually had an update before that, but not showing too much different from what we saw just out of Kotelnivka to the west. Just a small advancement that actually was meant to go in the day before. Don't worry too much about it. We'll move our way down onto the Velika Novosilka front line. Of course, we have areas like Vesely that you will be familiar with. And then we come in here. The Russian army made new advances northwest of this area along the Mokryali and main Ukrainian defense line. So what we're looking for in here is where then the Mokryali River runs, and more ground being made in here along where this blue defensive line sits, and also behind it in line with Ferivkia as well. What we do know is there's been a lot of mixed messaging coming from analysts, from think tanks, from politicians, from military leaders around Russia's capacity to reconstitute. We were told over the past couple of years that Russia has been strategically defeated for several decades, and then we hear that there's real risk to NATO coming. And a lot of the time we'll either call this the Russian paradox or Schrodinger's Putin. So let's look at what the German Chief of Defence has said today to BBC in an article titled "Russia May Attack NATO in the Next 4 Years." And this is by the BBC. This General Brouwer said NATO is facing a very serious threat from Russia, one that he has never seen before in his 40 years in service. At the moment, he said, Russia was building up its forces to an enormous extent, producing approximately 1,500 main battle tanks every year. We're also told that all of these are destroyed. They're not even close to meeting replacement. He says not every single tank is going to the war in Ukraine. but it's also going in stocks and into new military structures that are also facing west. Russia also produced 4 million rounds of 152 artillery ammunition in 2024, and not all of it was going towards Ukraine either. This is going to build up stocks. And this is figures coming from German and allied nations analysts, which mustn't be getting shared with the politicians. He says there's an intent and there's been build-up of the stocks for a possible future attack on NATO's Baltic state members. This is what the analysts are assessing in 2029, so we have to be ready for 29. If you ask me now, is this a guarantee that it's not earlier than 2029? I would say no, it's not. So we must be ready to fight tonight. Again, this is Schrodinger's Russia, Schrodinger's Putin. That how can it be tactically, industrially, completely destroyed, that they can't reconstitute anything, that they have no ability to increase technology, but it's also a real threat from fighting tonight or in 2029 of fighting NATO. And this is where narratives are starting to fall apart, and something that we have spoken about of if Russia in the next coming years is going to have the capacity to realistically launch an offensive war into NATO, the best way for Ukraine to survive as a state is to try and seek a peace now, because if they're going to be able to have the power to fight NATO in a couple of years, Ukraine's not going to be able to hold that off. Now, many have long feared an attack on a NATO state as it could trigger a larger war between Russia and the United States. But again, we thought that Russia was completely destroyed. Under Article 5, other member states must come to the defence of one being attacked. Nor has this ever truly been tested. Now, may they? Yes. Likely? Yes. With the gap we see with the US, I don't know if you could rely on that. But again, it has never truly been tested from another great state, another nuclear state. General Bauer singled out the so-called Suwalki Gap, an area borders Lithuania, Poland, Russia and Belarus as one of the most vulnerable, the ability potentially to cut off from there. He says the Baltic states are really exposed to the Russians. And once you are there, you feel this in the talks we're having over there. He said this showed the different perspective among European states of the threat of a possible attacks. Russia's view on the Ukraine war is different from the West's, where Moscow sees the war as a continuum of a larger conflict with NATO, and this is therefore trying to find ways into our defence lines and testing it. Now, he's got a lot more, of course, intelligence driven behind him, but I don't see this war as a continuum of a larger conflict into NATO. I actually see this as a limited war within the east of Ukraine to then have war manipulate and influence political decisions around Ukraine joining NATO, and as well as then collecting areas of leverage for then warm water ports in the Black Sea also. NATO members should therefore build up their military again. What we have to do now is really lean in and tell everybody, hey, ramp up, get more into it because we need it. We need to defend ourselves and therefore also build up deterrence. Asked by the BBC about NATO cohesion, given Hungary and Slovakia's close relations with Moscow, he insisted the alliance is still healthy. He pointed to Finland and Sweden's decision to join NATO, saying, I've never seen such unity like it is now among nations and military leaders. But the most powerful and 80% of that firepower in the US, I don't know at this point in time. He says all of them understand the threat is at the moment approaching NATO. All understand that we have to develop a direction of deterrence in the direction of collective defence. This is clear to everyone. The urgency is seen. His remarks are yet another sign of significant change in attitudes in Germany towards defence and Russia. But as Western military and political leaders say they are ready for the fight, questions remain on whether this is the case of ambition outpacing reality. It will take years for Europe's military industrial base to crank up to speed to match anywhere near the scale of weaponry that Russia is churning out. And also, everyone loves to talk about the combat experience Ukraine is gaining in this war. What you forget is the Russians are also gaining more combat experience on offensive operations. Now, why do I say more combat experience? Because throughout this entire war, for the most part, 90% of the time, Russia has been on offensive operations. There's been large failures, there's been large successes, but that experience is also being learned and changing doctrines. And that experience too isn't only exclusive to ground warfare like Ukraine's is. That experience also goes into long-range strategic bombing, tactical aircraft, maneuvers, helicopters, and to a smaller extent, naval as well. The US has been drawing down, not building up, its defence commitments to Europe to focus on the Indo-Pacific. And what I will say about this is, given the wealth that sits in Europe and the population that sits in Europe, they should be able to completely defend themselves. And for a long time have just been on the US tit of cheap defence. And US, Indo-Pacific, China, that's where the real threat to US regional hegemony really sits. So again, we will see what occurs. But again, this goes into this idea of then what we refer to as Schrodinger's Russia, that it's completely destroyed, another $1 billion to Ukraine will then win the war. Not then we see chiefs like this come on and go, yeah, they're a real threat to NATO in a couple of years, and they're currently outpacing us even in a number of years. We may get to that pace of industrialization militarily, and not everything that's being made is even being sent to the front line. It's filling up stocks maybe for further military operations. See what I mean? One thing you do need to take from this is those senior ranks of the military are an extension of politics as well. So there can be a lot said that matches political decisions made, and that drives industry and optics too. Legends, we went over a lot today, and I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I hope tomorrow you have a fantastic Friday. I'll speak to you then. Thank you. Bye-bye.